mean, I probably should start this by saying that I'm desperate to live in America. I really would prefer to live somewhere that's bigger, the people are more spread out. I think that the landscape is much more interesting. I'm a bit down on England generally, I have to be honest. I'm one of those.
Sounds like it.
I'm a self-deprecating Brit. That's what I am.
I wake up some mornings and wish that I was living in Cornwall or something. So we could maybe do a house swap sometime or something.
That sounds like a plan. And the one thing that always, it's a really trivial thing, but the one thing that always worried me about moving to America would be not being able to get tea in the way that it should be. Like, you go from one country to another, and the thing that you have, I mean, even if you have a McDonald's in England compared to America, it's different. And I've always worried about tea if I came to America. And to have this podcast just before we get started, me and you, two Brits separated by an entire ocean, and you messaged me and said that you'll be right on as soon as you've made yourself a cup of tea, as I'm stood by the kettle making myself a cup of tea, made me feel like that's a good sign that you're actually out there making.
I tell you what, you've hit the hot button, as they say. There's one thing that you can engage me on, perhaps even more than photography. It's tea, because having endured 20 years living in this country, I think we could do a separate podcast about tea and the deficiencies of this culture when it comes to understanding it, making it, selling it. So here I am. I'm pleased to announce, perhaps we can get some sponsorship, that I'm drinking my Yorkshire Gold and we're having a chat.
That's perfect. I had one cup of tea ever on stateside, which was actually in Canada on my honeymoon. And it was so bad that I just poured it away.
It was probably Lipton. It's disgusting.
It's horrendous.
Absolutely disgusting. Don't get me started.
Well, anyway, let's talk photography. We'll talk tea on a separate podcast, the new Kris, Karl tea podcast that I'll put together. But so let's start off the way I always do, which is just how you found photography in the first place. So what was it that got you to pick up a camera for the first time?
As I recall, I don't think this is going to be a terribly unique story, but as I recall, I was in middle school in Exeter. I was probably around about 10, age 10. And we had a fantastic art teacher. And of course, all the schools back then had the dark room, and they actually taught art and they cared about it. And we short story is we made a pinhole camera, and everybody had to bring in, some sort of body for the camera. Mine was a sort of catering size marmalade tin. And that was the body of the camera. And we made a pinhole camera. We made a photograph. In my case, it was of the sports field, and we developed it. And I didn't really look back since that moment. I mean, that's the earliest sort of memory I have. And then we had some cameras knocking around for various reasons, and I just started using them, and it sort of went from there, really.
Well, I've noticed a lot from I'm on a big run of recording at the moment, and I'm about 178 episodes in. So I've noticed that a lot of the experienced photographers that I've spoken to, especially those that are working in the industry, have a break from photography at some point early on. So they kind of discover it, like it, and then either like college or a career gets in the way for a short while, and then they rediscover it. So have you, since that start, have you always been in love with photography, or did you need some time away?
That was exactly my experience. Never fell out of love with it. Just the sort of the dials and gauges went up and down a bit in terms of being, I guess, wanting to do it or being able to do it. I mean, when I was applying for college, which is what I call from age 18. So after high school or sixth form or whatever it's called, I actually applied for, there's quite a well-known course in Newport Gwent, which is the documentary course there. And I didn't get on it, and I was completely gutted. And I ended up going to do an advertising course in Bristol, which eventually led me on the path of a career in advertising, during which I never really lost the bug for photography. And of course, having a family kind of creates moments to photograph in different ways. But I found towards the end of my career in photography, which finished about 10 or 11 years ago of my own volition, that I was traveling a huge amount all over the world. And I ended up wanting to, and eventually spending more time in the places that I was visiting, photographing and actually having meetings. So that seemed to me to be a pretty clear indication to pick up the pace again.
And as far as, there seems to be a bit of a fork in the road for a lot of people when they find the camera and they start to fall in love with the camera. And I think it really does divide people quite strongly, wanting to photograph people or being appalled or terrified at the idea of photographing people. So at what stage in this development from that first start did you kind of find photographing people to be something that you wanted to do?
Well, I love photographing people, and it's not necessarily just for the photography of it. So there are sort of various converging themes here, I think. One of the things I was told when I didn't get a place at the documentary course in Newport, which at that time was the place to go, was, I was 18. I'd had not a sheltered life, but I hadn't really been out in the world a great deal. And what they told me was, the thing is, you can obviously take photographs. That's not a problem. Otherwise, you wouldn't have got the interview. But what you need to do is you need to be out in the world a bit. You need to experience the world and bring that back into your photography. And they said a lot of the people that we have on the course are people who are maybe in their mid to late 20s who have done a bit of that. And so I took that to heart. I went out literally into the world. I mean, I traveled many, many countries in my advertising career. And during the time that I was getting into advertising and during the time that I was in advertising, the core of that job is essentially, it sounds a little bit dystopian, but basically the idea of advertising is to understand people to the extent that you can create work that impacts their behavior somehow. So it may be to carry on buying a product. It may be to buy a new product. It may be to change behavior in other ways. That's essentially what advertising is to me. In order to do that, you have to understand people. You have to be able to connect with people. You have to be able to generate insights about people. And for me, that's the parallel. So I never really lost that passion. When I went to Exeter College between the age of 16 and 18 to do A-levels. And the two things I really, really loved were communications and geography. And they were the things that captured my imagination. And they're the things that still capture my imagination. And I would maintain that they are the things that capture my imagination throughout my advertising career. So essentially, it wasn't like there was a moment where I got into photographing people. I think that, wherever it started, as I assume from an extremely early age, I just became very interested in human behavior and now communicating human behavior and personality through photography. So, whether it's studying communications, working in advertising, or photographing people, for me, it comes down to a very, very similar route.
I mean, yesterday I had a pretty lengthy conversation with a Ukrainian ballet photographer based in Montreal. I make sure I get all of that right. And one of the things that we talked about was the fact that he had previous history working in ballet, that it gave him a better understanding of, timing and form. And you can't photograph ice hockey if you don't understand the rules of ice hockey. I mean, you can, but you'll probably do a pretty poor job. You can't be a sort of photojournalist and not have your finger on the pulse of current events and what's going on and so on. So where you're talking there about kind of working within the psychology of people to change behavior, were you sort of externally to figuring out photography, as we all are the whole time that we're doing it, were you also making an active effort to kind of understand psychology of people a little bit?
I mean, that was essentially a lot of the job, was to understand people's psychology as it relates to brands and products. I'm not quite clear on your question. Are you talking about, did I in my own time study, to understand psychology? I mean, I think I did, not in a literal sense, like I didn't, study it on a course or pick up a book about psychology. I mean, I've read a number of books about psychology, but I think if you look at reading material, things that interest, movies that you watch, programs that you consume, a lot of it comes back to the same thing. There's that thread there. The earliest book I remember in communications really getting hooked by was a fantastic book that you can probably buy for a couple of quid on eBay now. It's a book called Man Watching by Desmond Morris. And it is the most incredible, it's a kind of one of those books you can just pick up and put down, pick up and put down. It's somewhere between a sort of, I guess it's a textbook really, but it's way more accessible than that. And it's just full of like fascinating things. And I remember one thing, going back to the point we were talking about America and the UK, that I remember so many individual things about that book, which I still have a copy of. The fact that American men sit in a very different way to European men. When they're sitting, European men often cross their legs. They often sit in a more of a sort of compact way.
Mm-hmm.
And American men, this is obviously a massive generalization, but the book suggests that American men sit in a much more expansive way, and they're more likely to sit open-legged.
Mm-hmm.
It's a much, the body behavior in different cultures is absolutely fascinating. So I books like that have stayed with me from when I discovered them to now.
I mean, you mentioned about being told that you weren't, I don't want to get this wrong, but kind of not worldly enough, and you need to go out and...
Well, that's correct. That's
right.
Exactly right. Yeah.
And to get told that at such a young age, but it feels like, I mean, I'm kind of doing a bit of a generalization here myself, but to look at the work that you're creating, and especially the book, which we will get to in time, that seems to have been quite a key moment in terms of forming. Is that something that sticks with you now, that you're still trying to see as much as you can and experience as much as you can as a way to benefit not only your photography, but just yourself?
Well, the easy answer to that is absolutely yes. I'm still as curious and as passionate about finding stuff out and discovering new things as I ever was. I think I absolutely have took that comment that they made to heart. I'm very lucky, during my career or during my life, I've been able to travel to, 40 countries. And, a lot of this comes down to, one of the questions I get most often is how do you approach people? How do you photograph strangers? And I would say the same thing. It's like, well, I just knock on their door or I just say hello to them. It's just, for me, it's the normal course of social interaction. I know a lot of people are challenged by that and don't feel so comfortable with it. But I think one of the benefits of being a bit more worldly is that you have that ability to engage on that level. And I think if you can do that and you can hold your own in a conversation, then I would suggest that most times you're going to get better photographs.
I mean, let's talk about photographing strangers, because I think that the trepidation that people have is in the approach, right? Once you're past that initial approach, everything else is pretty straightforward. You'll know fairly early on their disposition and what you can do to kind of work your way in there, or if it's just not going to be possible at all. I've had situations myself where there's been people through my line of work that absolutely don't want to be photographed, and the fact that you're a photographer is a huge sort of red flag to them for one reason or another.
Yeah.
Sort of your approach to building trust then with people, is it, are you setting the camera away from the topic of conversation? Do you get to know them first before you introduce photography, or is photography the thing that you lean in with?
It's nearly always better to get to know them first, in my experience. Everything I'm saying is really just from my experience. I completely understand it's not possible for everybody to work the same way or have the same kind of backgrounds and opportunities. But in my case, it's almost always better to get to know them first. Occasionally, having the camera gives you some form of legitimization, I guess. Mm-hmm. It's an obvious reason why you're engaging with that person. And I know for some photographers, for example, who photograph large format, which I don't, it's a sort of key to engaging a conversation, because the equipment is interesting enough that people want to have a conversation about it. And so I think that, once you can have that conversation, I think that's, as you rightly say, that's a long way towards, getting a great photograph, assuming that you can technically, get your act together, which most people can these days. I think, one of probably the biggest body of work that I've had most questions about in relation to what we're talking about is the Donald Trump supporters, who I photographed in 2016 in a part of the world where I live, which is in the Hudson Valley of New York. It's about 120 miles north of the city, but it's a very rural area. And there were many people who had made their own signs and put them out on their driveways or nailed it to a tree or whatever they'd done with it. And I went out, I literally drove around, walked around, found these signs and approached the people. And, there were some pretty kind of threatening scenarios, but they tended to be more visually threatening, like signs that were up about watch out for the dog or whatever. But, once I'd managed to find the people, to me, it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. I mean, my politics are diametrically opposed. I have a strange accent. They're not used to people. They're not used to people doing what I'm doing. It was a very, well, it still is, but it was a very kind of how can I put it? Explosive type of environment. We know now history has shown how much passion and anger there was and still is. But the thing is, one of the keys for me, and this is just, I'm going on a bit, but just to give you an example, was that at the same time, the whole Brexit thing was happening, which I'm also opposed to. But it allowed, most people that I was talking to had heard something about it.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, here was something that we could talk about that actually was entirely related. The two things were very much related.
Yeah.
The reasons for them, this is just my opinion, the reasons for them were in my opinion, related, and the feelings around it. And so, I'm still in touch with most of those people now. And I gave you that long-winded answer because I think it's important to express that photographing people is not, to me, it shouldn't be a transaction like going in to buy a bar of chocolate at the supermarket and walking out, where you have no care, interest, or whatever most times of who's taking your money or whatever. And of course, now it's a machine. That's a transaction. When I photograph people, what I try and think about is, well, I might know these people for a long time, and I still do. I would say that most of those people I photographed for that project, I'm still in contact with for whatever reason.
I mean, it kind of leads me on to the question that I've had to rewrite the most, and I still am not really happy with the phrasing that I have for it. So I'm probably going to have to work this out a little bit as I go. But one of the things that I actually wrote this more to do with the images of the book as opposed to the Trump one, but I think they actually probably relate more to the Trump one, just the way that I approached it in the initial part. As a photographer, you always want to kind of impart a little bit of your own personality into what you're doing. That's. I mean, you can't really help but do that, and in trying to not impart your personality, you'll end up putting more into it. By being overly aware of yourself, you end up kind of putting more of a fingerprint onto what you're doing. But when it comes to photographing someone's environment or someone's politics, how do you have your own personality within the photos, but not influence them within the image? Because if you're photographing someone in their environment or someone, let's say, within their politics, and that's kind of the surrounding theme of the image, if you don't have, if you either have or don't have similar political leanings to them, if you don't have, it could create a tension that maybe changes the visual of that person. If you do agree with them, you can almost exaggerate what they are, which I think is a problem media-wide today, is the exaggeration of certain things. How do you kind of photograph a stranger and let them show you who they are as opposed to influence it?
Okay, so I understand the question. I understand why you struggle with the question in terms of defining it, but I understand what you're asking. So I guess I have a couple of strands of work. One is the sort of work we're talking about now, which are essentially my own self-initiated studies, which to me is my sort of contribution of photographing people in this part of the world at this time. So I have that kind of thread to what I do. The other thread to what I do photographically is I do work for newspapers and magazines still. So, I work for The Guardian and New York Times, did a job for The Observer recently. And essentially that in the last, when I got back into photography properly 10, 11 years ago, I was working on a lot of assignments for publications like that. And so there's a certain approach and kind of ethical code that comes with that. Objectivity being at the heart of it. the thing that sort of doesn't come with that is that, well, actually, this is not fair. I was going to say, a lot of the work that I was doing was more sort of feature based. So I would, go to a farm and photograph a process at a farm, or, I would photograph a politician. I find these things it's all very interesting, but I also, they're really fulfilling a need for people to see what's happening around that situation. In a way, in the worst example, it's like illustrating the words, right? Mm-hmm. Then I got more into being asked to photograph portraits of people to go with features. So I did one a few months ago of a town near here that's had terrible trouble with water contamination, and I photographed a woman whose son had been basically poisoned by bad water, which had been poisoned by manufacturing process in the town, chemicals in the ground and so on. And she had passed something to her young son through her breast milk. And so I had to do a portrait of that lady up in a town near me. And, so more and more I got into that. So I'm telling you all of that because I sort of carry with me this need to try and be as objective as possible, whether I agree with the person or not. So in the case of Trump, the Brexit thing, I heartily disagree with them. And if they ask me about Brexit or they ask me about Trump, I would be very honest with them and say, no, that's not what I would believe in. Mm-hmm. And actually, I'm a green card holder. I'm not a citizen, so I don't vote here. Not that really changed anything. So the point I'm going to make to you is that, yes, there are differences of opinion. Yes, I agree that photography of this type there's a huge sort of autobiographical element. I would suggest that it's not very wise to take any individual photograph and say, oh, I can see Kris in that photograph, or I can see Richard in that photograph. That may be true in some cases. I think you have to look at somebody's work over a period of time and say, okay, I can see some themes and what's going on in this body of work. But what I do think is very important, whether you agree or disagree with somebody, is to have this sense of objectivity, which I carry with me anyway, because of course I'm not allowed to do anything to the photographs that I supply to newspapers, or I'm not allowed to influence anything or receive anything or all of that. But what you have to do, in my opinion, is you have to find some common ground. And I think the common ground so often is honesty. Like and it's in this sort of hyper polarized world that we live in, the thing that has really changed a lot is that it's become so much more difficult to disagree with people and yet still have a conversation.
Yeah.
And I think what's really important is that when you're making a photograph in that situation, you need to be able to be the sort of person that can disagree with somebody and still have a conversation. Because a portrait, in a way, it's like a good conversation. There's a back and forth. It's a collaboration. It's not a transaction. And so I think personally, obviously, my own opinion about myself is that I can most often do that. I can most often get myself in a situation where I can find some common ground with somebody and have a discussion and make photographs, regardless of whether I agree with them vehemently or disagree with them vehemently. And I think that's the thing. And people talk about truth. There are probably many truths, and so is it a true photograph for that person? Is it not? Well, maybe there are many true facets that could be photographed. For me, and this may be a nuance, but, just make sure it's honest, that it's an honest rendition of that person. And for me, that honesty is based in the ability to find some common ground, just be able to talk about things, whether you agree or not. And I found all of those people, nobody kicked me out. All they wanted to do was to have a conversation about it, which was great.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think the nail on the head is the inability for people of contrasting views to actually, you don't even have to find common ground, but to just talk and more importantly, to listen, which I think is a skill that's completely been lost. And
right.
considering the generations coming through, I am quite concerned about that ever kind of rearing its head ever again. If you don't mind me saying, I definitely feel I'm massively overmatched in this in terms, obviously, of experience, but I'm certainly not. I don't feel like I'm in the same realm in terms of worldliness and education, but I'm doing my best to keep up. So if I do sound stupid at any point, I do apologize.
No, not at all.
A little bit of a side note, because I'm kind of curious, given your history, what do you make of kind of the disposable nature of modern photography then? With so many pictures being taken by just about everybody, every picture that seems to be taken seems to there has to be a need for it to be seen with an immediacy. And people especially photographing themselves more than they're photographing anyone else. In terms of when it comes to phones, people are very particular now about self-image to the point where they're not really delegating the need for other people to take their picture. And I mean, in England, unless they're drunk, essentially, it's quite difficult to for someone to give up their own self-image away from their own phone. What do you make of that? Do you feel like that's potentially good or bad?
Just very quickly to go back on one thing about the worldliness. I'm not trying to suggest I'm the most worldly person. I'm just, and actually, one thing I haven't mentioned, which I should, is that I think worldliness does not necessarily mean going out and checking the boxes on everywhere you can possibly go. To me, I ended up in a place where actually most of the photography that I do is within 50 to 100 miles of my own doorstep.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it at that. But, to me, worldliness is more of a point of view than a sort of achievement. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it can come through reading as much as it can come through traveling or, anyway.
100%.
So to your question about modern photography, I think you called it. First of all, I don't think anybody's going to stop it. The technology has given everybody the opportunity to do, what they're doing, and things happen the way they will. And I think it's made, there are always two sides of the coin on this. So it's made it possible for everybody to make a technically decent photograph. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, that just raises the game in terms of, okay, well, how can I make a difference in that environment? So I'm not seeing it as a bad or good thing. I mean, I can highlight certain aspects about it. Like, I don't think it's particularly healthy that there's so much time spent and that people are so self-image aware. Mm-hmm. I don't know there's much I can do about that personally. So I just try and think about, well, what is it that I'm doing that is going to make a difference somehow, that's going to cut through some of all of that. And I'll come back to that in a second. I think you've also got to see these things potentially as inevitable evolutions of a medium that is still only, 200 years old or something?
Right.
Not very old in the context of other media.
Yeah.
But I think you've also got to break it down a bit, so my daughters are both in their early 20s now. And it was interesting seeing them as they experimented with film photography, because in a way, it became obvious to me that they were treating it like a different medium. They had digital cameras, and then they would pick up one of my film cameras and have a go with that. Or they were lucky enough to both attend a school that also had a dark room, believe it or not. So they were able to experiment with that. And what I observed was that they sort of saw them as different things. If you like, they're different instruments in the same orchestra. And so is a mobile phone, and so is a computer, a laptop. So I think there's no point fighting it. I think it's about just saying, listen, these things are inevitable. I think there's way too much hang up on, the technology and the gear side of it. Like, who gives a shit really at the end of the day? It's simply about saying, bring it back to your own situation and what can you do and how can you do work that you feel is healthy and is contributing something and is doing what you wanted to do. And, I know we'll talk about the book in a minute, but when I did the book, 276 people photographed, and not a single person in that book or in that series saw their own photograph before it was published. So I tell you that because not a single person insisted on seeing the photograph of them before it was published. And they all signed model releases. They all did the whole thing. So, I think there's a way of doing it. Sorry, this is very long-winded, but it's a huge subject. And I think that I try not to get bogged down in it, really.
Well, long-winded is always good on a podcast. It's maybe, I prefer long-winded to yes and no.
It depends who's doing it, I guess.
But yeah, I feel like the two negatives that really stand out, one being significantly bigger than the other, is we're getting to a point with an inability for delayed gratification. Like people need something immediately. And I think it's part of mobile photography or cell phone photography or however it's defined. I think that's part of just not that. It's all facets of life now. If you can't have something delivered on the same day, it's not worth your time. If you can't immediately get something the minute that you desire it, it's almost like it's too old and it's unwanted, and it creates this, you can look at like the Amazon model, which is a separate discussion in itself, much like tea. But the side of it that worries me quite a bit is the mental health side of it. I think that there will be an issue growing with maybe body dysmorphia or, just people that are too obsessed with self-image, too vapid, too self-focused, that I think I don't think human beings are meant to look at themselves as much as what they are. And it's a very bad focus, especially for younger people. I definitely don't think it would have done me any favors. I'm definitely not calling myself a young person, as I turned 34 this year. And it's starting to look like I've witnessed about 34 murders. I'm looking so old.
Well, Don't worry. You're way off where I am, so don't worry about it.
But I'm in England. We age much quicker. You've managed to escape to somewhere where you can take your time with it. Yeah, exactly. So let's go to the book then. I'll just open the floor for you here rather than get too in the weeds straight away. So just the inception of the book. What was the idea?
It actually relates to something that you mentioned a short while ago about, photography now that, billions of photographs taken and what's happening. So I've just recently moved house, but for the purpose of this, let's pretend I'm still there. So, and it's only a few miles from where I am now. So I lived between 2005 and a month ago in a town called Ghent, Ghent, which is not in Belgium. It's in upstate New York. It is named after the Belgian town, however. And for a while, I had been thinking about creating a series of portraits. And I was considering different themes or different ways of doing that. And I realized that it was the town's 200th anniversary, which in English terms is not really any great shakes, but in America, that's kind of it's a pretty momentous milestone, 200 years. So I was talking to, as they call them around here, one of the old timers, and he ran into his house and he grabbed something out of a cupboard that must have been in his kitchen, I imagine. And it was a beautiful old black and white photograph on a piece of card. And he showed me and he said, this is the Smith family in front of the old town garage, which is where they used to keep the snow plows and this, that, and the other. And he said, and there's, Stephen Smith, and there's John Smith, and there's Mrs. Smith, and then there's the three cousins here, and turned it over on the back and it said, 1912 or whatever it said. And it really struck me, entering into this bicentennial year, that, yes, we are taking billions of photographs every day, but nobody prints anything out. They're all consigned to people's attics, basements, rubbish bins when the phone dies. Like how many people actually do download their phones to a hard drive? Probably none. Nobody's making prints, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought, well, how about I embark on a project to photograph some of the people who are in the town during the bicentennial, just a snapshot of people, so that basically there would be something for people to look back on, like who was in the town during the bicentennial, because we have these fantastic old photographs and they're all well preserved on pieces of card or whatever, and we'll have nothing, absolutely zero. So I basically set off on that the bicentennial was 2018. I actually started at the end of 2017 because there were some subject matters that I wanted to get done, knowing that I couldn't go all the way to December 31st in 2018. Because if I wanted to like have an exhibition or something, I'd have to finish in like October. So anyway, so I embarked on the project. I will talk about process in a minute, I'm sure, but basically I ended up photographing 276 people. That's roughly 5% of the town's population, which is 5,400-ish. And then at the conclusion of the project, we had an exhibition, which was in a local sculpture park. They have a gallery. We used all their window space, gallery space, and we had 300 people show up, which was incredible. And what was really lovely about it is that it was all walks of life. It brought all of these diverse groups of people together at a time. You have to remember this was end of 2018, at a time where, you know, the divisions were really evident. And this is a town that if you said, how does this town vote? It probably would be 50-50. So it wasn't political. It was just about bringing lots of people together. We had the exhibition, and then essentially a few months after that, through a mutual friend, I was introduced to a publishing company called Daylight Books. And Daylight Books said, should we do a book of some of the photographs? So we basically did do that. We have 55 nameplates, so full-page photographs of portraits that we selected as an edit. But I was very keen to make sure everybody was included. So we did a big fold-out at the back of the book to include everybody who wasn't on one of the main pages. So again, sorry, that was long-winded, but that's my summary thus far.
Again, there's nothing wrong with long-winded, and it's always helpful to get as much context as possible. I mean, there's the one trouble you're always going to have being European, and I know that people don't like to think that the UK is European, but we are, is, and I watch a lot of American sports, is the pronunciations of some of the names can be fascinating. So I'm probably going to butcher this for the American audience, but I believe the lady's name is Jean Neifler or Neifela.
That's close. Neifler, yes.
Neifler, okay. So more down the Germanic route then of how to pronounce that.
Yes.
The portrait of her holding an old portrait of, I'm assuming, a family member and a cow. I'm assuming, looking at it, is one of the images that really, it is one of the images that were on this call. I felt like I had to kind of pester you into coming on to this because it's such a wonderful picture, and it has the feeling of what you're describing, where you saw this original old image and then you're kind of doing another sort of notch in the timeline. And this has both of those timelines kind of within it. And it's really what photographs should be used for more than what they are, is kind of documentation as opposed to vanity. And whilst it is a very, very lovely picture, it has the documentation side of it. So let's just approach it. And how did you know who you wanted to approach for this project?
So, you've really opened up the Pandora's box of long-windedness. Just a quick thing. The context historically of this area is that it was, as most people know, Manhattan was kind of, the British were there, then the Dutch were there, and then the British again, and then and then there were lots of German communities up in this area, Dutch communities, the big farmers. So there are a lot of very interesting names. I did, going back to our point about kind of worldliness, I read a number of books about this area. I'm not a great historian. I'm not a great reader of history at all, but I found a fantastic book about the area that's really engaged me. And I ended up contacting the guy who wrote it, who was a professor at a local university. And I had a chat with him. This is actually 10 years ago. And I told him I was going to do a project on the Hudson. And then literally 8 years later, that one didn't get off the ground. And 8 years later, I did this project. And in the end, I went back to him and I said, "You probably don't remember me." He did remember me, and said, "We had that great conversation. I told you I was going to do a project. Well, I've done it." And he said, "Well, that was 10 years ago." I said, "Well, yes, these things take time." And he ended up, I'm telling you that because he ended up writing the essay at the back of the book about the area. But so just for context on the names, there's a lot of German, English, Dutch history here in this part of the world. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the names, and I included the names in the captions for that reason. So I just want to talk about Jean Niefler for a second. Every one of these photographs has a story. So I'm just so lucky that the engagements with these people were fantastic. And Jean, I'd arranged to photograph Jean. I'd been in touch with her daughter, and her daughter said, okay, come round at, 4:00 or whatever time it was, and Jean will meet you at the old farmhouse. So I'd never met Jean before, but that family is a very well-known, long-established old farming family in this area. And I rolled up, I got out of the car, and I tend to just not carry, I just get out of the car and I'm ready to say hello. Anyway, she comes out of the old farmhouse, and she greets me and I greet her. And, she's obviously, she knows what the project is. We have a little chat about it. And she says to me, would you mind if I held this? And she revealed that she was holding a photograph that you mentioned, which is her husband with a cow. He was a beef farmer. And his name is Walt Niefler, and he is extremely well known in this area, but he had died a few months before that.
Right. And
for her, I'm tingling now thinking about it. It was such a special moment. That's what she wanted to do. And I thought to myself, this is just so wonderful. Like, I don't need to do anything. All I need to do is find an environment for us to photograph, and the rest will happen. And that photograph is no more or less complicated than that. And I think that it's actually the reason you opened up Pandora's box is because again, I get a lot of questions about this. I didn't ask anybody to carry anything, to wear anything. I would show up, we would find a spot. Now, it's not quite that fortuitous. I do a lot of research. I know the area. I know where some good spots are. I'll get to your question in a minute about how I contacted people. But it's really important to understand that there's as little intervention in these things as possible for me. These are not hugely set up photographs. For a start, they're all in natural light or ambient light if they're inside. There's no flash strobe, anything used. And for me, I just wanted to put 100% of myself into the relationship with the person. And I think you've picked on I'm so happy that you picked that photograph to talk about, because, it really does reveal a lot about the whole project, I think.
Well, one of the things I did note was obviously not being on scene and the way that photography is, I think you can tell something's ambiently lit compared to when there's some extra production involved. It's probably like the way I could phrase it. And I was curious if that was a sort of an artistic choice in the sense of the relationship you'd have with the person, making them more comfortable, or if that was going to be more of a environmental choice in the sense of not wanting to change the vision of the environment that they're in. And one of the things that makes the images so profound is the environment. It's as much a portrait of what's around them as what they are. And I think these are all fantastically characterful people, and you could definitely photograph them in a studio on a very simple backdrop with some strobes and get a very compelling portrait. But to include the environment means that this cake has icing too, so to speak. So it was just strictly down to you focusing on the person, it wasn't to do with the visual side of things.
Essentially correct. Yeah. Let me get back to this. I just want to just finish talking about how I found people, and I'll get back to that. So yeah. I would email people, knock on people's doors, write letters to people, call people, basically any of the ways that you can contact people as normal human beings. I did it. And very few people said no, which was fantastic.
As normal human beings is a good caveat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So I just wanted to make sure we'd covered that one, and we can happily get back into it if you want. But in terms of the environment, to pick up on a couple of things, the decision about not using any equipment is because all I want to do is focus on that connection. And, I used a Pentax 6.7, which for anybody who's familiar with it, will understand it's a super heavy, but super simple camera. For those that aren't familiar with it, about the most exciting thing on a Pentax 6.7 is the battery check light that does go on and off when you press a little button. But essentially you load your film up and you make a decision about your shutter speed and your aperture, and that's it. I mean, there's literally nothing else you can do. So that really suited how I wanted to do this. And I didn't want to be carrying lights around and all that stuff. And, so I think I got a question this morning, right before our conversation, from somebody who said, how is this lit? Because it's inside and I can't photograph inside with a Pentax 6.7. I don't know where to start with that, because it's like, well, you can, so it's not, I think people are so swamped with technology and like, in a way they're consuming too many YouTube videos, because it's like, actually just put all that away for a second and figure it out. And I think being resourceful is possibly the single most important asset to have when you're doing this type of work. You're constantly having to figure out whatever it is. And, the simplicity of the approach is for me the key, whether it's the equipment that I used or the way it's shot. So to get to your point about the environment, if you don't mind, I'll tell you a quick story.
Please.
So there is a photograph in the book, which, apologies to our vegetarian and vegan friends and animal welfare folks, is a photograph of a chap in front of a pile of deer skins. Okay, I'm not politicizing whether that's a good or bad thing, but it's a very big thing in this part of the world. Deer hunting is a very big thing. His name is Gary. He is the guy that you would take your deer to if you want it processed once you've hunted it. And he will take the meat, take the skin, separate them, all the rest of it. He was the first person I photographed. He was the person that I photographed first, because I knew that if I didn't include that important aspect of living in this area, that I would miss it at the end of the project, because I'd have to finish the project too early for the hunting season. So right. I photographed him. I think it was November. It was late November 2017, and he was the first person I photographed. And I made 10 photographs on a roll of film, and I got it processed, scanned, got it back, and I hated it. Really hated it. And I spent a week or two trying to understand why I hated it. And fortunately, I'd gone back. I'd agreed that I would go back, because I went on like day 2 of the hunting season when he said he didn't have much going on. He said, come back in a couple of weeks, so there'll be more going on. So I took him up on the offer. So I had another date. I think he was the only person I photographed twice, actually. But the reason I figured out, I spent a week to 10 days looking at books, thinking about it, trying to figure out why I hated the first photograph I made of him so much. And basically, the first photograph I made of him, inside his garage, there was a light hanging. There was a deer hanging on like a chain at the back of the garage. And he had an apron on. The apron had blood on. He had a knife in his hand. And I realized, it sounds obvious now, I realized that the reason I hated the photograph was very simply because all the information was there. So as a viewer, there was absolutely nothing for you to do. All you did was look at it and go, okay. And it was like a light bulb moment for me. I just thought, that's why I hate that photograph. Whether it's technically good, bad, or indifferent, doesn't matter. I just hate it as a photograph, because that's not what I'm trying to do. What I need to do is to express my own curiosity and my own sense of like, question about what's happening and who these people are and where they come from and what their backgrounds are and what's going on. I need to do that in a photograph. And so I went back and I photographed him. So the one in the book is the second photograph I made of him, but also the second in the series. And when he said there's more going on, I arrived and I said, I want less going on. So I shut the garage door. I took the knife out of his hand. He just was wearing an apron, and he was stood by the skins, and that was it. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's actually one of the more successful portraits in the book, because maybe I'm just too emotionally attached to the story, which is possible. But for me, it does that job of simplifying something, but at the same time, because of the way the information is presented, that it actually raises a lot of questions. And so, you're saying, what is happening in that photograph? Why is he wearing an apron? Why is there blood? What is that pile that he's standing next to? And so that became, if you will, the template for all the rest of the photographs. And, so I decided that the way I would do it was to include environment, because it's really important. And I'll sort of skip to some feedback that I've got, a great deal of feedback that I received that wasn't, what lens is that, or what, all the technical stuff. But so many people have said to me, one of the things that they really take when they sit down with the book and they go through it is that they get an incredible sense of place, not only from the people, but when you've gone through the photographs, they get an incredible sense of place by virtue of putting the jigsaw pieces of the individual environments together and understanding what sort of environment we're in.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So again, individually as photographs, what I was trying to do is raise those questions and kind of pique that curiosity. But what I hadn't realized, a sort of added benefit, was that as a collective, they also serve to build up this kind of sense of place that I didn't need to photographically describe. In other words, I didn't need to have like a landscape shot of where we are at the beginning of the book. And there is an essay at the back of the book which in words describes the sense of place. But I think that's one of the pieces of feedback that I've been most gratified by, which is, the ability of the little pieces of information in the environment to add up to something bigger.
Yeah. The way you're describing it and the way that it came across to me on first viewing the images is that they very much work together. And each individual image, I mean, there are some that definitely, I think, depending on the viewer, will stand out more than others, and they'll be preferential to other images. But to me, it feels very cohesive. And like you said, it builds up. Each individual part is part of the story, which I guess is the end product that you're aiming for. I really hate to do this because you've done exactly what I would make fun of, which is people that talk about gear, because it's almost never a useful question. But I'm a little bit curious because I'm very cinema focused. I watch a lot of films, especially older films now. And I'm very interested in decisions that are made in cinematography when it relates to psychology. And there's two questions about gear, and I promise you it's not about like which lens is sharp or any of that kind of stupid stuff. One is the film stock that you used, and did you know going in straight away, like you had a go-to film stock that you would use, or was that something that you had to put a bit of thought into to try a couple different things out and see what worked? And the other would be about the focal length that you're using to get that environment, but still get that separation.
Yeah. I just for the record, I don't mind gear questions. It's become a bit of a thing with me because I still get quite a lot of questions on Instagram and stuff like that about it. And the difference between your question and some of those questions is that your question is in the context of an overall conversation about the work, whereas it sort of gets a little bit samey if, everybody, people's first question is about the gear,
yeah,
as opposed to about the work. Anyway, so that's just my 2 cents, as I say here. To answer your questions, which are good ones as far as I'm concerned, are the film stock. I just got into using Kodak Portra. I'm very comfortable with it. I feel like I know how it behaves without. I'm not the world's greatest expert by any means, but and so I just started shooting it on Kodak Portra. I used either 160 or 400. I ended up using mostly 400. I mean, it's incredibly versatile. As you know, people get it. People who understand that will not need any explanation of that, but it's quite forgiving and very versatile. The film stock and the lens question are actually very much related. They obviously, you need everything to work well together and to look good in the final analysis, but and I do very little to these. That's something else that I get asked a lot. I do very, very little to these scans that come back. I mean, and I include cropping in that. I try and do, for this project, I've tried to do everything in the camera that I could possibly do. And, really, I don't want to be sitting in front of a computer doing that work all the time. So, as far as the lens is concerned, I started with the Pentax 6x7, actually, technically, and a 105 lens, which has a maximum aperture of 2.4. And once I really got to grips with the project and I started it, I actually bought a second body and a second lens because I wanted to not, I feared being in the middle of the project and the camera failing on me or the lens failing on me and having no backup to continue the project. I've since sold the second body and second lens because I'm not a gear collector, but that was the reason that I did that. Anyway, so I had the opportunity to try the 90 millimeter lens as well. I think it was a 90. And the 35 mil equivalents on these are, something like 55 mil, something like that, on the 105, something like that. So pretty standard. Anyway, I just preferred the 105 to the 90, although the 90 is very, very nice lens. So I ended up selling the 90 and the second body. So now I still only have the original. And the reason that the questions are related is because I decided that I wanted to, after my first experience, which I've described of the guy with the deer, I wanted to make sure that the environment was there, but not in a way on such equal footing as the subject. So I did want to create just a bit of out of focusness to it, which I did. And I found I could successfully do that using that 105 lens. The reason that sometimes I use Portra 160 is because in order to get the lens open enough, sometimes I just needed to drop the speed of the film on a few occasions.
Right.
But my go-to would be Kodak Portra, the 105 lens, and shooting pretty wide open if I could. And if conditions didn't allow, I'd either change the film stock or move.
Right.
That's the other thing people forget. If it's not working for you, go somewhere else. And I've got a whole kind of thought process on that as well in terms of location. So, which we can get into if you like.
Well, one thing I would like to ask, especially with this project being very geographically poignant, is did you have any pushback or did you have any sort of trepidation yourself about being a Brit photographing something that's historical to a small American town?
I had zero concern about that, and I had zero pushback about it because, again, I think, with a bit of thought and with the right approach, and when I say the right approach, I'm including body language in that. It's what you say, but it's also how you come across. Your reasoning for it, your motivations for doing things, your connections with other people in the town who can legitimize you, or no, not that's the wrong word, but can vouch for you. I had zero problem with it, really zero problem at all. I think what it came down to was that here was a town of just over 5,000 people, and I was the one who was, putting the considerable amount of work into research and photographing for everybody's benefit, hopefully, and I say that with all humbleness, for the future, and so, and actually I had some people, I funded the project myself, but I had some people around the town who threw some money in the hat to help me process the film, which was lovely. So I got a lot of community support. So before you embark on these things, having that level of support is really a fantastic following win.
I mean, then to go back to the sort of the beginning of this, you had, I think you said about 5,000 people in this town.
Just over, yeah.
And I mean, I'm imagining no one's chipping in enough for you to take multiple roles of 5,000 people. So
Right.
the selection of who would be important to this. I mean, you mentioned the relevance of the deer, I don't know, processor. The relevance of that person is there to be seen. Was it very straightforward for you to think who would most benefit this project in terms of telling the story about the town?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't ever want it to become what they call in America a checkbox activity, where you sort of map everything out and say, have I got a deer processor? Have I got a fisherman? Have I got a lady that does this? I never wanted it to be that. And I never thought it could be that, because with 5,400 people, my job, as far as I was concerned, was to get a snapshot of who is in the town. So the reality is, though, having said what I just said, is there are some people who are only here at the weekends because they come up from the city. There are some people who have been here, their families have been here since it started. And there are some people who are more sort of Johnny come lately, like I would be considered even after 15 years. So basically what I did is I was mindful of those general categories without becoming obsessed about the detail of every single aspect of this, that, and the other. My job, as far as I was concerned, was to convey what it was like, what the people are like, what the community's like at this period of time, in this town. And so I just set about kind of just contacting people I knew. And as I told you before, knocking on doors randomly, emailing people, all sorts of methods. I had a massive Google Doc that I would kind of, keep track of who I'd contacted. And if I needed to get back to somebody, I mean, again, this is probably a whole other podcast, but as I was driving around, I think there's 47 miles of road, 140. Anyway, there's all the road. I drove all the roads in this town, and I figured out different things. I saw more things than I could ever imagine seeing in terms of discovering, like, oh, there's a house at the end of here, and I could see where the light was at any given time of day. I could see some great backgrounds, some interesting people working or on their driveways or whatever it would be. And I would just make a mental note, and I'd get home and I just add it to the list. Well, maybe check out this place. And that was it. It was really about just being out there in the world with a small W, because it's a small town of 5,000 people, and figuring that out. And at the end of it, I was curious enough to basically do a count. And I went through all the people that I photographed, 276. And I figured out, okay, how many of these people did I know beforehand? Like, oh, Kris, I know, he's my neighbor. I'll call Kris because he'll be game for it. And it turned out that I knew about 18% of the people. So I forget what number that is, but let's say 10. So I knew about 50 of the people beforehand.
Right.
The other 225, 226, I'd literally never met them. They wouldn't know me from a hole in the ground.
Right.
Beforehand. So it was important for me not to make this a project about people I know. It was important for me to make this a project about who's in the community.
Yeah, it's something that I'd almost like to see. It's weird because it's fantastic as a standalone thing, but it's almost like the fascination for me would to see it be done in other communities that are vastly different, that maybe have like different climate and a different sense of industry and so on. Especially if we can avoid. I'll be honest with you, I absolutely hate modern times. I think modern design is ugly. I think everything is very utilitarian. It's to see something that has character and has color and has age to it is a lot of what makes it interesting. I think if you were to do this project in New York City, I would be interested, but probably not as visually interested, because it would be too easy, and it would not too easy, but it'd be too common. It's too much of a scene thing. Yeah. To see this done in, I've interviewed people in the past that have done projects in like really rural Canada or South America or South Africa or anywhere like that. To me, I think it's more down to my, again, probably come back to my lack of worldliness, but to see those things through a microscope as opposed to a generalization is what makes it so fascinating. And the visuals are fantastic.
Well, I think I totally agree. I mean, the thing is, the mistake that I find a lot of people make who ask me questions about this project is that they're trying to think about their own project that might be on similar lines, is that they're making the mistake quite often of exactly what you talk about, which is, you actually, in a way, my advice would be start with something way more microscopic.
Right.
Because New York City, what's interesting about that? But, it could be one street or one block in New York City. It could be one street corner in New York City. To me, that has way more chance of being interesting.
Yeah.
Because the more specific you can get, you might disenfranchise some people, you might polarize people, but the work will be stronger. I mean, my version of microscopic was, as I said, 149 miles of road and just over 5,000 people. That's all you need,
To your point, I think polarizing people can actually be very beneficial when it comes to art, because you never really find a fanatic about vanilla. You need to create, you need to have people not like it to generate the people that do like it. I think that's kind of how the universe works. I think if you have everyone kind of say it's okay, and I do think we are in an epidemic of okay at the moment. Like there's a lot of art that's being created for the sake of finances or whatever, without a lot of soul put into it.
Well, the restrictions make you better as well. The restrictions, it's like having a camera that does nothing but take a photograph. Then you have to really think about how you're going to use that. When you're photographing in a more microscopic environment geographically, then those restrictions force you to have to think more creatively and differently about the problem. It's like, New York City is such a massive canvas, and just because it's there, it doesn't mean to say it's going to be good to photograph. And it's been photographed a million times by a million different people. Mm-hmm. But give yourself the restrictions, fence yourself in, and find a way out.
I honestly, music to my ears. It's like I always feel like the best thing you can do to become more creative is to limit yourself. When you're given too many options, you can't focus in on anything. I think that's where a lot of people go wrong with gear. I think that's where a lot of people go wrong with genre of photography, where they, I'm not sure about, maybe we disagree here, but I feel like in England, we have a camera club mentality quite a lot of the time, where one week you're this kind of photographer and the next week you're another kind of photographer. And I feel like through that, you can learn a lot of interesting experience, but you can gather more knowledge that way of photographing different things. But you end up where your expression, I think it was like ticking boxes, checkbox thinking of, you're just kind of, dusting stuff off the list. So one thing that stands out is obviously like the pre-production and the admin side of this, all the emails, the letters, the driving around, the conversations, then to have the photographs. Very quickly, when you were photographing people, were you immediately sending off those rolls to be processed so you saw them, or did you wait until the end once the project got rolling to do it all in one go?
It really happened in batches, to be honest.
Okay.
So I didn't give myself the luxury of thinking, well, I'll shoot a roll, I'll send it off to be, developed and scanned, and then if I don't like it, I'll go back and shoot again. I didn't want to go back and photograph people, so I would photograph most times one roll per person, which on a Pentax is 10 frames, sometimes 2, very occasionally 3. And then I would sort of, depending on, inevitably, depending on the time of year and what was happening, there would be an ebb and flow in the project. So sometimes I was sending off 20 rolls, sometimes I was sending off 2 rolls. It just depended, but there was no strategy to that. So
it's an incredibly laborious project in terms of the people that you have to, that's a lot of people to approach. That's a lot of people to then photograph. It's a lot of driving around. It's all of the letter writing, like I say, the admin side of it. Then you're getting film back. You're making decisions about which images tell the story correctly. Then you put the book together. The whole project is nowhere near as probably simple as maybe some people would look at it, because of the way that photographers can think, where you're like, well, he didn't take lights, therefore simple project. There's so much to this. There's so much effort that's gone in from front to back. Do you feel like when you came out at the end of it, that did it sort of light a fire that you wanted to go straight into the next project, or you wanted to go and photograph something straight away? Or did you feel like, that'll do for now, I'm quite tired? Like, I feel like I've really underlined a significant project and I can kind of sit back for a little while and contemplate it.
Good question. First of all, I don't give a shit if people are worried about whether they use lights or not. For me, if the photographs are good, then that's all you need. And I'm happy to hear that you feel it comes across simply. I mean, it was not simple. I mean, I think the elements of it were simple. There were just many elements which kind of complicated it. But I'm happy to hear that it comes across simply, because that's basically that would be how I'd like to be thought of. As far as the project thing is concerned, it is interesting because, I think, you talked about the sort of mentality of the camera club, and I can't really speak to that in England because I've lived there for 20 years. But I'll tell you one thing that I've observed in the photography community is that, if you finish with a project, and, bear in mind, once I'd finished taking the photographs, then we went into book production. So that was another year, basically. So that's in itself its own project. Excuse me. And I think there's this kind of thing that happens in photography circles where, if you're seen to have finished one project, that people's response is, what are you working on now? What's your next project? You're like, well, I just, I'm coming up for air, basically. So yeah, I've learned, I think that's an experience thing. I've learned that I don't need to be like constantly projecting. I did start another project right before the pandemic, and I've continued through it. Which I can describe briefly in a second, but I don't feel the need to sort of be, constantly be able to explain what project I'm working on now just because I finished the previous one. I think you do need to allow yourself. It's interesting when you said, when we were talking, when we first came on online about, you took 2 or 3 months off recording. I think you have to do that. You have to take these spaces. You have to create that space for yourself, fill up the tank again, and off you go again. And it makes you, you need to experience some other things, and that generates new thoughts. Like, I'm thinking at the minute that actually what would be really nice is just to find interesting people to photograph, and not actually attach it like a Christmas, not attach them like decorations to a Christmas tree. Just like, I'm just going to photograph some interesting people.
Right.
And, a lot of people take that approach. I mean, one of my favorite photographers is Alex Soth. And, I think he does that a lot. He just photographs out in the world, and that's it. He doesn't go out and say, I'm now photographing people who are wearing yellow shirts.
Right.
For other people, including myself, that's worked really well, having that purpose. So, it's just different things for different people. But I don't feel the need to really jump from one to the next with that level of immediacy. I'm lucky enough to be able to fund my personal work through the work that I do, commercially. And so I don't, that's just how I do it. And I don't feel the need to sort of, be super subscribed to projects all the time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, 100%. And to just sort of circle back on my use of the word simple, I in no way intend for that to come across in a negative sense. To me...
Oh, no, I take it as a compliment.
Well, your images remind me a lot of the cinematography of Roger Deakins, and I love his approach, which is, it's about telling the story, and it should almost get out of the way of people enjoying what it is that you're putting in front of them, as opposed to, trying to do wheelies for the sake of the fact that you can do wheelies, and trying to show off for the sake of showing off. And that's the sense I get. It's every image to me is diegetic. They all correlate to each other, but they also stand alone.
What does that word mean? What does that mean, Kris?
Diegetic in the sense of like, it all feels like it's all part of the same environment.
Okay. Right.
It's not, it's very difficult. And I think as a wedding photographer, it's one of the things I struggle with the most. Is I have, 10 hours to photograph a wedding, and I start sort of middle of the morning, usually in artificial light, because this country is painfully dark and we don't know how to buy daylight balanced light bulbs. And then I have to photograph a ceremony that's usually mixed lighting, through to outside stuff that's in natural light, and then back into artificial light at the end of the day. And the hardest part of my job, much to the annoyance of people that think that weddings are terrifying experiences, they're really not, is actually trying to make things look smooth and in relation to each other. I don't want it to look like it was shot at 4 different days or in 4 different environments. I want it to look like it matches. And with this project to shoot it over the time that you have done and in different weather environments, different locations, different environments, different people and so on. Like the image of Jeff Brown in the church is the same story as the image of Steve McCagg by the digger. It doesn't look like it's not from the same story, which I know, considering you're like incredibly well published and exhibited, this probably just sounds like I'm telling you well done for tying your shoes, but it's something I just don't really see a lot of in photography anymore, is that sort of consistency of style, but also to create a body of work that I can live in, as opposed to just look at one standalone image, like that image, look at the next one, like it, but there could be inconsistencies across. It looks like it could have literally been shot over the course of a week and on like a very high production thing, but it's almost a contradiction itself, because it looks simple and the photography doesn't get in the way of the people that are there. I'm not distracted by an unusual choice of lighting. I'm not distracted by, trying to show off by shooting through, a load of foliage to get this, that. Like it's simple, but it's complex. And like, that's like the coolest thing you could do with photography. The fact that it's diegetic is amazing.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Sorry, I interrupted. Go on.
My curiosity would be, would you see this? Because this is the one thing that's amazing with photography, and it's something that I've learned from doing this podcast, is that I can absolutely love something someone's done, and then they are indifferent to it because they had an idea at the outset and it didn't, because of circumstances and limitations, it maybe didn't turn out the way that they wanted it to. Do you feel that this was a successful project?
I did feel it was successful, and I'll qualify that in a second. Photographically, I just want to actually clarify something. I mean, you mentioned I forget the adjective, I forget the words you used exactly, but exhibited and printed and published and
published and exhibited, yeah.
I don't really feel that's the case. I mean, I really feel I'm still learning a huge amount. I hesitate to use the term emerging, but I still feel I've got a lot to learn, and every time I go out and photograph, that's the case. I don't consider myself to be, perhaps how you describe me. But anyway, that's just semantics maybe. But I love what you described about being able to live in the work. I hadn't thought about it like that, but that goes back to what we were saying about the environment. That the minute you can get inside it and feel like you can move around inside it. I mean, for me, that is a really interesting observation. And there's nothing better for me than to be considered simple yet successful in terms of how work is communicating. To me, that is what I'm going for, and I think the equipment is a thing. And the next thing that I've been working on since this, actually, I've used a completely different camera because I didn't want to get into. I wanted to shape things up a bit. I don't care about the cameras, to be honest. I want them to do a job, but they're doing a job for me. They're doing a job that I want them to do, that I have to be happy with, and that's my main source of kind of decision on whether the work gets out there or not. Kind of lost my thread on what you asked me because I wanted to go back. The
successfulness of the project for yourself.
So success. I mean, I think that success for me is being on a podcast with Kris, and Kris saying, it's very simple, but I can get inside it. I can live inside it, and I can get more out of it. That's success. Success for me is I've been very fortunate, lucky enough to have a book published, which, I got 600 copies myself, and I've sold pretty much all of them to 24 countries and 32 states in the US, which I'm very grateful for. And I could never have imagined, because that was not what I set out. I didn't imagine that we would even do a book. I just was going to do some portraits. Success for me is that the town hall in Ghent, and the historian, Ghent actually has its own historian who's like obviously a part-time guy, but he's a fantastic, engaging, interesting bloke. And I printed off, first of all, every single person who was photographed received a nicely printed copy of their photograph, which I printed personally and gave to them personally, 276. I also printed a second set of photographs, 276. They're all individually named and signed. And we found the town bought some acid-free envelopes, and they found a nice box. And they have basically received those prints from me. They've archived them, and there is now in the town hall a box of 276 prints with other information about the bicentennial and a letter from me and a certificate of authentication, so that in 100 years' time, when somebody says, wow, what must it have been like in 2018 at the bicentennial when they're celebrating the 300-year celebration, they'll be able to go to that box and they will be able to find an archive of prints with people's names and dates. That's success to me. So I think it's success on many different levels. Without me sort of blowing a trumpet, could I have done stuff better? Of course, totally, absolutely. No question of that. Would I do the book differently now? Yes, absolutely. But I think you'll be hard pushed to find a photographer that's published a book that wouldn't say that. Mm-hmm. And I think also, I think you asked me if about looking at the work. I mean, I think it's interesting. I know a lot of photographers who publish books, and most people don't really look at their book very often. I mean, I dragged a book off my shelf before this call in case, we wanted to refer to anything, and I hadn't picked it up for a good while, so I don't leave it out on my coffee table and look at it every day. I mean, you kind of move on, but it lives there, and it's, it's an achievement, and it is hard work. And, for me, success is the gratification of doing it on a number of different levels, which I've explained to you. Yeah.
And I think as well, success is defined by what you were trying to do to begin with, so.
Yeah. Although at the same time, the reality is, Kris, that I think, again, I interrupted, I apologize, but I think it's important to say, because I know a lot of people listening to podcasts such as this and other ones that I've done, say, well, how do you get started? You need to have everything defined. And they're literally caught in the headlights, and one of the hardest things about any of these things is to start it. Just start it. Get out there, just start, even if it's the kernel of an idea or an atom within the kernel of an idea, because once you get out there and start, it will evolve. It evolved for me. All of my projects evolve. As far as I understand it, most projects for most people evolve, unless it's a very tight brief and a script almost. Things evolve. So just get out there and do it. So, I think learning and being flexible is really key to these projects. And we haven't talked about that, but I think it's really important to understand that.
Well, it's actually my last question before we wrap up, because I've taken too much of your time. But what was the main thing that you learned through doing a project like this? What was the takeaway, the biggest takeaway for you?
I think the biggest single thing, and I have to tell you that I came back, and this is not unique to this project we're talking about, the book. It's unique to most times I go out and photograph people, is that I'm always bowled over by how amazing people are. We live in a seriously, occasionally unpleasantly divided world where even people who you'd think could have a conversation about things they disagree on seemingly can't. And, quite often in England, as well as in the US and many other countries, politics is split down the middle, families are split down the middle. But I come away from these experiences feeling so humbled and amazed by how people are. And perhaps the biggest single thing is, do not judge books by covers. Do not look at people and assume that you understand them. Try and engage with them. And photography is my way of engaging with the world and with the people in the world. And every time I do that, I'm always amazed. And sometimes I want to kick myself for making assumptions that I shouldn't be making. Yep,
100%. The division is, yeah. It's what makes the world a real treat at the moment, I think, on top of a pandemic and everything else. It's something I wish we could work our way through. I mean, I honestly feel like I could listen to you talk about this for weeks, in all honesty, but I always have this.
I'm not sure that would be good for you.
I always feel like I have this imposition about myself where I'm taking up too much of people's time. So I think that's a really nice place to draw a line under things. I'm even more excited now to take delivery of the book tomorrow. I'm very excited about it. To add to my extensive collection of photo books, I feel like more people should be buying, because it's so wonderful to have printed things as opposed to just stuff on your phone.
Well, thank you again for buying it, and I hope at some point we might get the opportunity to meet. And if you want, I'll inscribe something in it, of course.
Oh, that would be incredible. I'll definitely make.
Give us a sense of your favorite book that you've seen in the last year, or whatever. I mean, favorite books are kind of a ridiculous question, but what's sticking in your mind at the moment, book wise? Give us a recommendation.
So there's a photographer that's come on the podcast a couple of times. He had a new book called Skin, which was large format black and white portraits of non-models nude in various poses, and it was about them kind of being comfortable within the things that other people would shame them for, or stretch marks and so on. I think that book changed the way that I kind of viewed photography, and it also changed my view of film in it being more of a device of honesty as opposed to what digital is, which is more of a vanity thing, and we're always looking to fix things, and it kind of showed things. And then it's a tough one because there's so many.
Well, it doesn't have to be a new one, just something that sticks in your mind.
I mean, I'm picking from several. I absolutely love. Okay, 1 second. I've got to make sure I get the title right. So there's a book called Marilyn and Me by Lawrence Schiller.
Yeah,
and I'm not a big Marilyn Monroe fan. Like I'm indifferent. I'm not a fan. I'm indifferent. But I am aware of her cultural significance, and unlike a lot of photo books about this kind of thing, it's about a very specific time in her life. It's about a very specific time in the photographer's life, and there's a lot of story to go with the images inside. So it's to make myself sound as uneducated as possible here, it's very much a podcast and a book all at once, which is really nice because although I do like images that leave you to answer some questions yourself, these are very well documented images, and it's just a very fascinating point in history, I think. So yeah, that would probably be my current main read. Yeah, so let's do the important stuff now then. Please plug the book. I want people to buy the book. I don't care if you don't want to plug the book. I want you to plug the book because I want people to buy. I want people to buy photo books, and this is a fantastic looking set of images. I can't wait for my book. So please tell everybody the name of the book and the best place to find it.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you. So the name of the book is All of Us, with a subtitle, Portraits of an American Bicentennial. So All of Us is basically what it goes by. And my name is Richard Beaven. You can get it from the publisher Daylight Books, which they're in the US. So that is easy if you're in the US, or dare I say, there are many other independent bookstores that still have a few copies, I think. But of course, you can also get them from the Amazons, whether it's US, Canada, UK. And I still have a few tucked away here. So if you're around here, I've still got a few. You can direct message me on Instagram, and my Instagram is at Richard Beaven. I guess that's about it. But I thank you again for buying it, and I hope everybody does buy it, really enjoys it.
Well, this podcast this particular episode is the exact reason I started it, was to learn as much as I can about the process behind someone doing something and their history. And this has been just fantastic to just be a part of. So I really do appreciate you taking the time. Please, everyone, go follow, and I'm absolutely demanding people go buy a book, provided you can still get hold of a copy. But again, massive thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kris. I appreciate it. Good luck.
You've got me questioning my position. Am I just filling out? Taking space, not with as much grace. Am I a second choice of all the not Rolls Royce? Dresses and lace, help me now. If it's not my